welcome to the deep dive. We are covering something today that is, frankly, going to fundamentally challenge how you view the infrastructure of the modern world.
Yeah, it really is a massive topic.
If you follow the undercurrents of culture, specifically the men's rights activist space, a broader MRA movement, and the ideas circulating within the red pill manosphere, you already know there's a massive conversation happening beneath the mainstream radar.
Right, it's this massive undercurrent.
Exactly. And today we're taking an ultra-long, incisive, and truly fascinating look at a highly controversial new worldview that is gaining undeniable traction in those exact spaces.
It is gaining a lot of momentum.
But before we get into it, I want to ask you to make sure to like and subscribe to this show. We are going to be unpacking an immense amount of material today, and subscribing ensures you won't miss any of our future deep dives.
It really is a dense text. The sheer scope of the arguments requires a lot of careful unpacking today.
Absolutely. So today's focus is an exclusive review of a provocative ebook published in 2025. It's titled Church of Female Supremacy: Satanic Coven Synod, Sacramental Abortion, and Simp Altar Boys by Conrad Riker.
Quite the title.
Doesn't pull any punches.
Yeah.
Our mission here is to meticulously dissect Riker's core thesis, which is his claim that our foundational modern institutions, the family unit, the church, the education system, and corporate America, have been systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Yes.
We're going to look at the history of these institutions prior to this alleged capture and how they operate now. And if you find this analysis compelling and want to explore the source material yourself, you really need to check Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books to buy this ebook.
Highly recommend looking at the primary source.
Also, if you want to follow the author's ongoing writings, you can find him at Conrad Riker at Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com.
Now, before we start parsing the actual arguments, I need to make an explicit impartiality disclaimer to you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
The source material we are examining today contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it touches on intense flashpoint issues across cultural, religious, and political spectrums.
The most intense issues you can think of, really.
Exactly. So I want to make it unequivocally clear right now that neither of us is taking a side, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints, ideologies, or conclusions of the author.
Right.
Our sole mission today is to impartially report on the contents of the ebook. We are here to dissect Riker's concepts, analyze his historical claims, and examine the data he presents so that you can understand the precise architecture of this specific worldview.
We are just the messengers here.
We are presenting the arguments exactly as they are laid out in the text, leaving the final judgment entirely up to you.
Setting that framework is crucial because, Riker's manifesto doesn't stick to just one lane. The book covers everything from evolutionary biology to theological revolutions, all the way to the rise of what he calls a decentralized digital citadel.
It's a very sweeping theory of everything.
It is. And to really grasp his overarching theory, we have to start where he starts, which is the biological mandate. Riker argues right out of the gate that men and women are biologically, hormonally, and neurologically different.
Fundamentally different.
And that evolution designed us for distinct functional roles. He posits that men are built to lead, protect, and provide, while women are built to nurture, bear children, and bind communities together.
The way he frames this biological baseline is really essential to everything else in the book. He isn't just saying these differences exist,
Right.
He's arguing that these very specific functional evolutionary roles are the exact mechanisms that built human civilization. They are the load-bearing pillars of human progress.
Which made sense historically.
Exactly. But the conflict, according to Riker, arises because modern social theories are attempting to tear down these foundational roles under the banner of equality.
Right, but he redefines that word.
He does. He defines equality in this context not as equal opportunity, but as a weaponized term. He claims it operates as a Trojan horse for female supremacy and male disposability.
That's a heavy claim.
It is. He uses a very utilitarian analogy early on. He compares the sexes to tools. He notes that a hammer isn't a failed screwdriver, and a screwdriver isn't a failed hammer. They simply have different functions.
Right.
The crisis we face today, he argues, is that society is treating the male hammer as an inherent problem that needs to be socially engineered or deconstructed entirely.
And that leads directly into his critique of the phrase toxic masculinity. He points out this glaring paradox. Mainstream culture has essentially rebranded natural masculine traits as a public health crisis.
Which is fascinating when you look at what keeps society running.
Exactly. As Riker points out, society absolutely relies on those exact traits to survive. Look at police officers, firefighters, combat soldiers, deep-sea welders,
They're
engineers.
dangerous jobs.
Right, these are overwhelmingly male-dominated fields that require physical aggression, immense risk tolerance, and stoicism. Society depends on that strength, but simultaneously pathologizes it. He makes the claim that we have literally medicalized heroism.
To illustrate that this instinct is biological rather than just a product of socialization, he brings in a very visceral historical example.
The volcano, right?
Yeah, he takes the reader back to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. He points to the archaeological discovery of Roman soldiers whose skeletons were found fused to the heavy metal gates of Pompeii.
That imagery is wild.
It is. They had stayed behind, manually holding those heavy gates open while being buried in ash and fire, specifically so that the women and children of the city could escape.
Wow.
Riker's underlying sociological point here is that you cannot socialize a man to stand in front of an erupting volcano. You don't get that behavior from a corporate diversity seminar.
No, you definitely don't.
He argues that the willingness to sacrifice oneself to protect the vulnerable is coded deeply into male DNA. It's the same instinct that makes a firefighter run into a burning building.
Right.
By labeling the foundational elements of that instinct as toxic, he asserts that society is effectively punishing men for their fundamental nature.
That imagery of the soldiers at the gates is incredibly heavy. It forces you to think about how society categorizes duty versus what it labels toxicity.
It really reframes the whole conversation.
It does, and it transitions perfectly into what Riker calls the double bind of the modern man. If men are biologically wired to be these protectors and providers, Riker argues that modern society violently exploits that wiring.
The exploitation is a huge theme for him.
He claims men are trapped in an impossible scenario where they are expected to perform like flawless machines, earning, protecting, providing seamlessly, but the absolute second they express traditional masculine dominance or falter even slightly, they're punished.
The margin for error is zero.
Zero. He uses a very grounded modern anecdote about sitting across from a divorce attorney to illustrate this.
Yeah, the divorce attorney anecdote really brings the macro theory down to the micro, everyday level for the reader.
It makes it very relatable.
Riker describes this pervasive phenomenon of men working double shifts, basically destroying their physical health and grinding themselves down to provide a certain lifestyle.
The dream kitchen, the house.
Exactly. A beautiful home, financial security for their wives. Then, a few years later, they are hit with divorce papers, and the primary reason cited is that they were emotionally unavailable.
And he completely tears that phrase apart.
He totally deconstructs it. In his framework, emotionally unavailable is a systemic label used to penalize men in a society that demands absolutely everything from them.
Their labor, their time.
Their labor, their resources, their time, while offering no loyalty or respect in return. In the anecdote, the attorney essentially tells him that his willingness to work endlessly to pay for everything was viewed as proof that he wasn't emotionally present.
Which is a crazy catch-22.
Right. Riker frames this as a system that ignores biology when it is inconvenient for women, but weaponizes it against men whenever it serves a financial or social advantage.
If that's how he views the secular domestic sphere, the way he applies this framework to the spiritual realm is even more intense.
Oh, the theology section is explosive.
This is where the book dives into the capture of the church. Riker dedicates a massive portion of the text to arguing that feminism hasn't just influenced modern religious institutions. He says it has entirely colonized them.
He backs up this claim of theological colonization by looking at the feminization of spiritual authority.
What does he mean by that specifically?
Well, Riker argues that if you look at mainline Protestant seminaries today, they have largely abandoned traditional scriptural teachings regarding gender roles.
Okay.
Instead, he claims they are force-feeding students feminist dogma imported directly from secular theorists like Betty Friedan and Judith Butler.
Bringing secular theory into the seminary.
Yes. In these academic religious environments, he asserts that traditional masculinity is treated akin to asbestos.
Asbestos.
Yeah, it's viewed as a toxic, hazardous material that has to be systematically stripped out of the building's foundation before anyone is allowed to safely worship inside.
The specific institutional examples he uses to map this shift are highly detailed. For instance, he points to the United Church of Christ, the UCC.
The 2019 resolution.
Yes, according to the book, in 2019, the UCC adopted a formal resolution that labeled abortion as a sacrament.
A sacrament.
They described it as a holy act of self-determination. Riker analyzes this not just as a political stance, but as a profound theological revolution.
It's a massive shift.
He argues they are taking a medical procedure that historically the church would have condemned and elevating it to the exact same religious standing as baptism or Holy Communion.
And he traces this ideological shift right into academia as well. He notes that Harvard Divinity School hosted a feminist theology symposium in 2023.
What happened there?
At this event, speakers were openly referring to patriarchy as the original sin.
Wow, original sin.
Furthermore, he looks at the funding structures behind this, highlighting the She Preaches movement.
Right, the funding is a big part of his argument.
He points out that this initiative, which is aimed at training thousands of women to take over historically male pulpits, received funding from George Soros's Open Society Foundations.
Which is a very secular political organization.
Exactly. Riker's critique here is that immense capital is being deployed to actively displace male spiritual leadership, while simultaneously offering zero institutional support or programming for fatherless boys who are drifting away from the church.
Which brings up a critical question that he asks.
Yeah.
What happens to the young men and boys when the church undergoes this kind of transformation?
They get left behind.
Right. Riker introduces this concept of the simp altar boys and the overall demise of male initiation. He explains that historically, the church anchored young men through very specific mechanisms.
Hierarchy, risk.
Exactly. A degree of physical or spiritual risk
Yeah.
and rigorous ritual. He uses the traditional altar boy as the prime example of this historical mechanism.
Right. He emphasizes that the traditional cassock worn by an altar boy wasn't just a costume, it was a uniform.
A uniform implies duty.
Yes. It represented the first rung on a ladder of initiation. It demanded discipline and precision, and it was the first step toward taking on the heavy, serious responsibilities of fathers, priests, and community leaders. It instilled a deep sense of duty.
But then he contrasts that historical tradition with the reality of the modern church. He specifically singles out the Episcopal Church for replacing the traditional male-oriented altar boy with gender-neutral liturgical assistants.
The
He
rebranding.
includes a quote from a teenager in the book who described this new role as being like a Starbucks barista for Jesus.
That quote really sticks with you.
It does. Riker argues that boys are intrinsically wired to be knights. They want to serve a high mission with a sense of gravity and risk.
Want to be challenged.
They do not want to be customer service reps handing out bulletins. By stripping away the gendered weight and the rigorous initiation from these roles, he claims the church isn't achieving equality. It is creating a massive emotional void for young men.
And Riker measures the fallout of that emotional void by pointing to the demographic collapse currently ravaging various denominations.
The numbers he brings up are startling.
He presents a very clear cause and effect relationship using specific data. For example, he notes that the Evangelical Covenant Church approved female bishops in 2021.
Okay.
Within just 3 years, they experienced a 27% drop in overall membership, with their youth retention rate plummeting below 15%.
27% in 3 years is huge.
It's massive. To put that in perspective, a 27% drop in a 3-year span isn't a slow generational decline. Structurally and financially, that is a catastrophic mass exodus that threatens the viability of the entire institution.
He also points to Saddleback Church, which is one of the most prominent evangelical megachurches in the country. They ordained women pastors in 2022. According to Riker's data, their attendance dropped 32% in just 18 months following that decision.
32%.
And on the more extreme end, he looks at Sweden's Lutheran churches, which he claims have started hosting menstrual moon rituals and burning sage to the divine feminine.
And the result of that.
The result is that male attendance in those specific congregations has dropped to roughly 18%.
Riker's definitive conclusion from all these numbers is that men are not overly complicated in their institutional loyalty.
They see what's happening and react.
Exactly. When a church replaces the masculine ideals of sacrifice, strict discipline, and duty with a culture focused on emotional healing, inclusivity, and safe spaces, men simply recognize that the spiritual authority has been fundamentally feminized.
And they walk away.
They walk away. They withdraw their presence and, crucially, their resources.
But this withdrawal from hostile environments doesn't just start in adulthood, though. Riker traces this systemic hostility right back to the classroom.
The early years.
Yes, he refers to the modern education system as the matriarchal classroom, which he argues acts as a simp pipeline.
Let's look at his analysis of the 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act.
The federal funding.
Right. He states that this federal act allocated $150 million annually for gender equity programs. But Riker claims that in practice, virtually all of that funding was directed toward programs exclusively for girls.
Even though boys are the ones struggling.
Exactly. He juxtaposes this funding disparity with the reality that boys are the ones objectively failing in the modern classroom. Boys are receiving lower grades, they are diagnosed with learning disabilities at much higher rates, they make up the vast majority of expulsions.
And the suicide rates.
And tragically, yes, they account for a significantly higher rate of youth suicides.
The underlying analysis Riker provides is that the educational system isn't just failing boys by accident, it is structurally hostile to natural male behavior.
It's a feature, not a bug, in his view.
Right. He argues that schools are literally medicating boys, simply for acting like boys. The system punishes rough and tumble play, pathologizes high male energy, and demands that young boys sit completely still and constantly check in about their feelings.
Which goes against their biology.
Through this process, Riker claims the system is engineering a generation that is biologically male, but psychologically neutered.
Psychologically neutered.
They're being conditioned to believe that their ultimate value to society lies in their compliance rather than their competence or their drive. In his view, this isn't a push for educational equality. It is an institutional attempt to extinguish masculine traits before they can fully develop.
And once they leave the classroom, they are hit with what he calls the media erasure of the father.
The media section is really fascinating.
Riker is deeply critical of how mainstream media and corporate advertising portray men. He points to a specific 2022 campaign by Disney Plus titled Strong Moms.
What was his issue with that campaign?
He means that this campaign didn't just sideline fathers or make them secondary, it erased them completely from the narrative.
Just gone.
Gone. It showcased women managing households, executing perfect parenting, and essentially doing everything flawlessly on their own, actively projecting the message that a male partner is entirely unnecessary.
And then he brings up the music playlist.
Right. He also brings up a Disney music playlist titled Dad Jokes, which was explicitly marketed with the tagline, "For laughs, not leadership."
It's important to understand why Riker focuses on these seemingly small media examples.
Yeah.
He doesn't view the bumbling dad trope as harmless comedy.
No, he takes it very seriously.
He argues that portraying men, especially fathers, as incompetent comic relief who can't figure out how to use a washing machine is a highly calculated statement of intent.
It's psychological conditioning.
Yes, the persistent she runs everything at home narrative is systematically designed to weaken the perceived necessity and authority of the father figure in the public consciousness.
And what's the end goal of that, according to him?
Well, Riker's broader sociological claim is that the ultimate goal of this media strategy is to elevate the single mother as the societal ideal.
Why elevate the single mother?
Because, he argues, a society composed of fragmented families and single mothers inherently invites greater government involvement.
The state steps in.
Exactly. It creates a larger welfare state dependency and effectively breaks apart the traditional nuclear family from the inside out, replacing the father with the state.
And if you attempt to point out this dynamic online, Riker argues you immediately hit the wall of big tech censorship.
The moderation double standard.
He outlines a massive double standard regarding platform moderation. He points to YouTube demonetizing and banning Andrew Tate's content, labeling it as dangerous hate speech.
Right.
Now, Riker argues that regardless of how one feels about Tate's delivery or persona, the core of his content was primarily advocating for rigorous gym routines, strict financial discipline, and male self-respect.
Basic self-improvement stuff.
Yet, he was entirely deplatformed. Meanwhile, Riker points out that the exact same platform actively promotes, monetizes, and algorithmically pushes channels like Feminist Frequency.
Which have a very different message.
Channels which frequently host videos with titles akin to "Why Men Are the Problem."
The contrast he draws regarding the video conferencing platform Zoom is perhaps even more jarring because it involves active organizing rather than just content creation.
This was the summit ban.
Right. Riker details how Zoom banned a men's mental health summit in 2022. This was a conference specifically organized to address male depression and the shockingly high male suicide rate.
A suicide prevention event.
Yes. Yet Zoom canceled the event, allegedly under their hate speech terms of service.
Unbelievable.
Conversely, Riker notes that Zoom allowed a women's rage therapy webinar to proceed without issue.
And what happened in that webinar?
During this webinar, speakers actively advocated for ending male dominance and explicitly called for burning the patriarchal archive.
Burning the archive.
Riker uses this side-by-side comparison to argue that the digital public square is entirely rigged. One event was focused on healing and suicide prevention, while the other was focused on ideological destruction and rage.
But only the male-focused event was deemed a threat.
Exactly. Only the male event was censored.
Let's move from the digital square into the physical workplace and the courtroom, because this is where Riker claims the most tangible damage is done.
The corporate section.
He calls this the corporate and legal strangulation of men. He starts with human resources departments.
He quotes Peter Thiel here, right?
Yes, he uses a quote from Peter Thiel, who referred to modern HR departments as ideological compliance enforcers.
That's a strong phrase.
Riker argues that the entire architecture of modern corporate culture is specifically designed so that betas men who are highly compliant, agreeable, and never challenge the consensus are the ones who get promoted.
The yes men.
Meanwhile, the alphas, the high-performing men who focus strictly on merit, tell uncomfortable truths, and push back against inefficiency, are systematically marginalized or purged from the company.
To ground this in data, Riker dissects a well-known internal study from Google called Project Aristotle.
This is a fascinating study.
Google spent years and massive resources trying to mathematically determine the perfect team dynamic. Publicly, they concluded that psychological safety was the ultimate key to a successful team.
But Riker points out the leaked data.
Yes, he points to leaked internal memos that showed a very different reality. The internal data actually revealed that teams that challenged leadership, tolerated interpersonal conflict, and took aggressive risks objectively performed better and innovated more.
They got better results.
Much better. However, those teams were rated lower internally simply because their abrasive excellence made middle managers feel uncomfortable.
So feelings over performance.
Google, Riker argues, made a conscious choice to prioritize agreeableness and emotional comfort over actual objective achievement.
He perfectly contrasts that corporate sensitivity with Elon Musk's management style at companies like Tesla and SpaceX.
Musk is the ultimate counterexample here.
Musk is notorious for demanding 100-hour work weeks, publicly reprimanding engineers who fail, and firing employees who complain about work-life balance.
Very old school alpha.
Riker argues that mainstream corporate culture labels Musk's alpha style as toxic. But he points out that this exact style is the reason Musk's companies are literally colonizing space and revolutionizing the auto industry, while legacy companies stagnate.
And he compares that to Boeing.
Yes, he then compares this to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, suing Boeing in 2021. According to Riker, Boeing was targeted for attempting to promote engineers strictly based on merit, test scores, and peer reviews, rather than adhering to externally mandated diversity quotas.
This corporate prioritization of compliance over merit leads directly into what Riker calls the criminalization of competence.
This was a very powerful chapter.
He makes a fascinating and stark comparison between how bureaucratic institutions operate versus how capable traditional men operate during a crisis. He looks at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
The contrast there is night and day.
While FEMA, the official government agency, was paralyzed by red tape, and politicians were just holding press conferences, who was actually out in the floodwaters saving lives.
Civilians.
Riker points out it was armed civilian men, off-duty cops, ex-military personnel, regular working-class dads from across the South who hitched up their own boats, completely bypassed the government permitting process, and rescued thousands of people from their rooftops.
Without asking permission.
Riker's argument is that modern society actively criminalizes this kind of raw alpha competence when it occurs outside of a state-approved bureaucratic framework.
We call them vigilantes.
We shame the men who take immediate decisive action as dangerous vigilantes, while we cover for the bureaucrats who completely fail to protect the public.
But according to the book, the place where systemic hostility against men is most heavily and legally weaponized is the family court system.
The family courts.
He calls this chapter the legal war on men. He unpacks how the legal system functions essentially as a massive mechanism for wealth and resource extraction from men.
He shares an anecdote from Florida that is just mind-blowing.
The text message.
Yes. A father was penalized with a loss of 50% of his child custody time simply for texting LOL to his ex-wife when they were arranging a pickup time.
Just for texting LOL.
The ex-wife's legal team flagged the acronym as emotionally dismissive and uncooperative, and the judge agreed.
When we talk about how that happens practically, Riker details the use of court-mandated co-parenting apps.
He calls them forensic traps.
He describes these apps as literal forensic traps. It's not just that they facilitate communication, it's that every single emoji, every mundane text about packing a school lunch or adjusting a schedule is permanently recorded and then forensically scrutinized by opposing legal teams.
It's
The communication is constantly twisted into evidence of either manipulation or micromanaging. It creates an environment where a father is constantly communicating under the absolute threat of legal penalty.
And then you factor in the financial devastation of no-fault divorce. Riker highlights that the average divorce in the U.S. costs around $15,000 in legal fees alone, and the vast majority of that financial burden is borne by men.
It bankrupts them.
He frames modern marriage purely in the legal context, not as a romantic partnership, but as an extreme, unmitigated liability.
A hostage situation.
He argues that men are essentially held as financial hostages, forced to participate in a legal system that demands they fund the destruction of their own families and the removal of their own children.
This systemic financial exploitation is the perfect bridge into Section 5 of his thesis, where Riker outlines his overarching economic theory. He terms this the red pill economy.
How does he connect all these dots?
If you connect everything we've just discussed, the biological expectations, the feminization of the church, the hostile education system, the compliance-driven corporate world, and the extractive family courts, Riker argues that society is actually functioning on a deeply hidden, unspoken caste system.
A caste system.
Men, he posits, are the expendable class. They're the ones expected to do the dangerous, dirty, and deadly work. They build the bridges, maintain the electrical grids, fight the wars, and die in the industrial accidents.
The harsh reality of infrastructure.
He brutally summarizes this by stating that men die in the coal mines so that their surviving spouses can receive the insurance payouts and the corporate CEOs can receive their annual bonuses.
On the flip side of that coin, he points to data showing that women control approximately 70% of all consumer spending in the United States.
70%.
He categorizes women in this economic model as the protected class. So the dynamic, as Riker sees it, is that men produce the foundational wealth and infrastructure through expendable labor, while women allocate and spend that wealth.
Production versus consumption.
He argues that until men wake up to the reality of this hidden economic caste system, they will continue to be exploited.
But Riker doesn't just lay out this bleak assessment and stop there. He presents a very specific, actionable philosophy for men who realize this is happening.
He offers a way out.
He calls it the trifecta solution: lift, build, lead.
Break that down for us.
Step 1 is to lift. He tells men they must lift weights and engage in rigorous physical training to reclaim their biology from a modern environment saturated with sedentary screen time and low-quality, hormone-disrupting diets.
It's about forging physical resilience as a baseline.
Step 2 is to build. He urges men to build their own independent wealth and businesses. This is how they escape what he defines as the rent-slave economy.
Let's actually define that term, because he uses it a lot. When Riker says rent-slave economy, he's not just talking about literally renting an apartment.
No, it's much broader.
He's talking about a broader, modern economic system where you own absolutely nothing. You lease your car, you subscribe to your software, you stream your media, and you rely entirely on a massive corporate employer for your health care and your paycheck.
You are essentially a modern serf.
Building independent wealth, in Riker's view, is the only way to sever your reliance on those corporate HR departments that actively despise you.
And step 3.
Finally, step 3 of the trifecta is to lead. He commands men to lead their families and their communities unapologetically, asserting that nature only respects function, capability, and survival, not modern feelings, focus groups, or safe spaces.
This brings us to the culmination of his entire manifesto, the digital citadel and the Brotherhood Reborn.
The ultimate endgame.
Riker poses a massive hypothetical. What happens when millions of highly capable men adopt this trifecta philosophy and decide to opt out?
What happens?
The result is a decentralized exodus from mainstream society. He analyzes this through the lens of censorship, noting a fascinating paradox. When mainstream institutions attempted to completely silence figures like Andrew Tate, who, let's remember, had garnered a mind-bending 12.4 billion views on TikTok before his coordinated banners, it didn't stop the ideas.
It backfired completely.
It actually poured gasoline on the fire. The harder the legacy system pushes to censor the male perspective, the faster and more resilient the alternative movement becomes.
Because They don't just disappear, they migrate. Riker points to the massive migration of men away from highly moderated platforms like Reddit, YouTube, and traditional social media, and toward alternative, decentralized platforms.
The new digital landscape.
We're talking about video sites like Rumble and Odyssey and heavily encrypted communication channels like Telegram. He specifically points to Nostr, which is crucial to understand.
Nostr is very important to this.
Nostr isn't just another app, it's a decentralized protocol. That means there is no central server, no corporate headquarters, and no tech CEO who can flip a switch and shut down a user's account. It makes top-down censorship practically impossible.
And the data he provides on this migration is striking. Citing Pew Research from 2023, he notes that 43% of young men are now actively using these alternative decentralized platforms.
Almost half.
Furthermore, privacy-focused messaging apps like Signal and Session saw their male user growth spike by 400% between 2022 and 2024.
A 400% spike.
Men are systematically abandoning the digital public square because they have realized the algorithmic rules are entirely rigged against them.
But what is truly fascinating is that this exodus isn't remaining purely digital. It is manifesting in the physical world.
Brick and mortar.
Riker details the actual brick-and-mortar construction of parallel institutions, which he collectively refers to as the Citadel. These are real-world spaces where men are gathering entirely outside the purview of HR departments, family courts, and mainstream cultural oversight.
He gives some incredible examples.
He talks about the Backyard Brotherhood in Montana, a network where men meet to discuss everything from managing combat PTSD to funding independent side businesses, deliberately doing so without any female presence or state-licensed therapeutic oversight.
He also highlights a facility in Ohio built by a man named James. It's a $200,000 a year gym operation specifically dedicated to mentoring fatherless teenage boys.
Mentoring through action.
Crucially, the mentoring is done entirely through rigorous strength training and discipline, explicitly rejecting modern talk therapy. Riker mentions the Iron Mountain Men's Retreat in Idaho, which he describes as a 40-acre compound run almost like a paramilitary monastery.
And his own experience.
He even details his own personal experience paying $500 a month to gain access to the Red Pill Ranch in Wyoming. It's a sprawling property where men are trained in advanced self-defense, sustainable agriculture, and off-grid survival skills.
And the most brilliant part of this physical exodus is the legal strategy behind it. Riker outlines how these groups are utilizing a very specific legal loophole to protect themselves from government intervention or discrimination lawsuits.
The Supreme Court precedent?
He points to the Supreme Court ruling in Roberts v. United States Jaycees. Riker champions the idea that these men's groups should legally incorporate as private fraternal religious societies operating under the same legal precedents that protect historical organizations like the Elks Lodge or the Freemasons.
That's a huge legal shield.
Under current U.S. law, these private fraternal groups are legally permitted to exclude members based on gender, and they can achieve permanent tax-exempt status. Riker is essentially providing a legally bulletproof blueprint for men to build sovereign, men-only spaces that neither the government nor feminist activists have the legal standing to infiltrate.
The ultimate demonstration of this newly formed, decentralized organizational power was witnessed during the clandestine Men's March on Washington in 2024.
The march that nobody heard about.
This event was entirely ignored by the mainstream press. It wasn't organized by politicians, and it wasn't funded by traditional think tanks. Riker details how it was organized entirely via peer-to-peer encrypted Telegram groups.
Uncensorable organization.
It is funded completely outside the traditional banking system using privacy-focused cryptocurrencies like Monero and Bitcoin, meaning authorities couldn't freeze their assets.
What was the turnout?
Riker describes the scene. 18,000 men arriving in the nation's capital, completely silent, highly disciplined, dressed in suits and boots, and unapologetically male.
That's a massive show of force.
Because it was decentralized, there were no official leaders for the police to arrest and no public spokesman for the media to cancel. It was a massive physical demonstration of a parallel infrastructure that has been built entirely in the shadows.
It is an incredibly powerful visual to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into Conrad Riker's worldview, let's summarize the ultimate endgame he is proposing.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Riker's book isn't just a critique. It is a comprehensive, step-by-step map for a complete withdrawal from mainstream institutions. He is actively urging men to stop asking for permission to exist within a system that hates them.
A system that actively suppresses them.
He wants them to aggressively reject the simp pipeline of modern education, to walk away from the feminized church, to opt out of the corporate rat race, and instead focus all of their resources, capital, and energy on building private, legally protected sovereign brotherhoods.
Reclaiming the mandate.
He is calling for men to reclaim their biological mandate by completely and unapologetically detaching from the societal structures he argues are engineered to destroy them.
Before we conclude, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. A logical extrapolation of Riker's thesis that isn't explicitly resolved in the text.
Let's hear it.
If Riker's vision actually comes to pass at scale, and a massive demographic of the most capable, protective, and economically productive men in society entirely withdraw their participation, their tax dollars, their labor, and their protective instincts from the mainstream, what happens to the core infrastructure of the wider civilization left behind?
That is the $1,000,000 question.
If the expendable class that literally keeps the electrical grids online, the water running, and the supply chains moving simply retreats to exist in these parallel citadels, does it force a massive, peaceful societal reset and a renegotiation of gender dynamics? Or does it trigger an unprecedented, catastrophic collapse of the entire social contract?
A total systemic failure.
It is a profound question about the structural load-bearing pillars of our society and what happens when those pillars decide they no longer want to hold up the roof.
That is an incredibly heavy and vital question to think about, and it perfectly encapsulates why this book is causing such a massive stir. If you found this deep dive into Conrad Riker's controversial worldview valuable, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show so we can continue bringing you these intense, unfiltered explorations of the ideas shaping our culture.
We have a lot more material to cover in the future.
And a final reminder, if you want to read the source material and examine these arguments for yourself, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Church of Female Supremacy, Satanic Coven Synod, Sacramental Abortion, and Simp Altar Boys.
Read it and decide for yourself.
Finally, you can follow the author directly and read his ongoing work at Conrad Riker at Substack by going to conradriker.substack.com. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we will see you next time.